APO, and thanks for the great job that you're doing. So hello to everyone, and welcome to everyone watching us from Africa, from Dubai, and from anywhere else in the world. Now, we know that the African Union is fully represented at the ongoing Dubai World Expo. And let me say from the beginning that we invite you to visit that beautiful stand. So this is our first press conference on the activities at the Expo. And today we will be discussing disaster risk reduction. For that, we have a panel of experts to take us through all the issues. So the African Union, in collaboration with the Expo team, will be hosting its very first event at the Expo Dubai 2020 under the theme of Disaster Risk and Reduction, DRR. The event will look to harness some of the continent's leading minds in the fields of climate change, disaster risk and reduction to further bolster the steps taken in managing extreme climate risks across the African continent. And that particular event will be held tomorrow, the 13th of October, and it will showcase Africa's efforts on disaster risk reduction. So to take us through the theme of our discussions today, we have Dr. Levi Uche Madweke, and he is the African Union's Expo Commissioner General. We will also be joined by Mami Mizutori, who is the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and head of the UNDRR. Also joining us today will be Mr. Ibrahima Sheikh Diong, who is the UN Assistant Secretary General and Director General of the Africa Risk Capacity, the ARC. My name is Wayne Musabayana, and I'm Head of Communication at the African Union Commission. Welcome again to our press briefing. So to kick off our discussions, let me invite Dr. Levi Madweke for some opening remarks. Dr. Levi, it's over to you. Dr. Levi, you have the floor. I think perhaps Dr. Levi is having a few problems. He was with us a second ago, but I think he's having some connection issues. Anyway, we will invite him to give us those very important opening remarks once he has been able to join us again. So let me move straight on to inviting Ms. Mami Mizutori. And as I said, she's the special representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and head of the UNDRR. Ms. Mami, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I'm delighted to join this press conference with my dear colleagues, sisters, and brothers from the African Union. And please, my congratulations for the opening of the AU Pavilion during the whole time of the Expo. It's really important. And it's wonderful that the very first event at the AU Pavilion will be, as the moderator has just informed us, the event on disaster risk reduction tomorrow. And tomorrow is the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. It's a day that we celebrate, commemorate every year in the face of the increasing frequency and intensity of disasters all over the world. And every year we focus on one of the 7 global targets of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is the global blueprint for disaster risk reduction, prevention, and building resilience. This year, we are focusing on the target to enhance international cooperation for disaster risk reduction. Now, it is very important that we are celebrating with the African Union, my colleagues at the African Union, this important day. Why? Well, first of all regions of the world are impacted by disasters, whether it's related to climate emergency or the COVID. But we all know that the African continent is where so disproportionately to your, let's say, contribution to the cause of climate emergency, African continent is constantly impacted by disasters of all sorts, droughts, floods, and hurricanes, cyclones that didn't used to come to the African continent that often before. The second reason I would say is that when we look at the intensity of COVID and we know that only 4% of the Africans are actually vaccinated, there is absolutely not enough solidarity in this crisis. The rolling out of vaccination needs to happen now. And that's also why it's so important to commemorate this day and call for enhanced international cooperation. The other reason I would say that it is so important that we commemorate DRR with you is because the agenda of disaster risk reduction has been rolled out in the African continent hand in hand between the African Union and my office, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. We will be also co-organizing the regional platform for Africa next month, hosted by Kenya. And importantly, all this means that African Union, the African continent, the African people are no longer just beneficiaries of international cooperation, but you are our leading partners. And just to give you one more example, the African Roadmap for Impact-Based Early Warning System and Transboundary Risk Management. This is something that the African Union UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction is co-creating with all the member states of the African Union, with support from a wide range of donors, Italy, Sweden, and they all feel that it is so important that Africa is taking the lead in all of these important issues, most of all in disaster risk reduction, which impacts everybody and which erodes all the development gains that have been achieved up to now. So this is why I am really happy to be with you today and to be with you tomorrow. And later on, I would be very happy to receive more questions on how we cooperate. Over to you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much. And that was Ms. Mami Mizutori, as I said, from the UNDRR. Thank you very much for those remarks where you touched on the reasons why it's important to celebrate the day that commemorates disaster risk reduction. And you also spoke about the role, the key role that Africa is now playing as a global citizen in discussions to mitigate the impact of disasters, even though you said Africa is not a big contributor to that crisis. So thank you very much for those remarks. I see that my brother, Dr. Levi Uche Madweke, is now back, and I'm going to give him the floor to make his welcome remarks. And Dr. Levi is with the African Union, and in Dubai, he is our Expo Commissioner General. So Dr. Levi, today I will not call you head of division, I will call you Commissioner General. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Winnie. I think there was a breakdown over here, and sorry about that. Excellencies, the government of the United Arab Emirates, our host, distinguished guests, African citizens, Africans in the diaspora, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. I wish to thank you for honoring our invite, and I want to welcome you to this opening press conference that we proudly host as the African Union at the Expo 2020 Dubai. The event for tomorrow, 13 October 2021, will be the spotlight on Africa on disaster risk reduction and climate resilience. This will be the first of the several anchor events framed around AU Agenda 2063 that will be featured through the 6 months of the Expo. These events will also feature spotlights on Africa, on health, infrastructure and industrialization, culture and arts, youth, ICT, gender, peace and security and governance, trade and investment, agriculture, and many more. This great event is organized in partnership with the United Arab Emirates government, African Union Regional Economic Communities, United Nations agencies, and our esteemed member states. The Expo 2020 Dubai offers the African Union an opportunity to further entrench the relationship between Africa and the UAE, leveraging on the long-standing economic partnerships between the two regions, whilst also taking into account the opportunity it offers us to showcase the continent-wide commitment to sustainable development through the African Union Agenda Strategic Framework, as well as explore opportunities for potential partnerships required, for the continent's economic transformation. Our message is simple and is one: Africa is ready and open for business. Africa is a sustainable global partner in the present, in the future, and beyond. And Africa has unlimited multi-sectoral opportunities worth exploring. Throughout the 6-month-long stay, we hope that as the African Union, we will be able to achieve the showcasing of the progress that has been achieved towards the creation of a conducive business environment in Africa and project the continent as business-friendly. We wish to showcase unlimited investment opportunities that exist on the African continent amidst its diverse human and resource endowments. We will also showcase Africa as a continent that has success stories across the sectors and regions. We are going to utilize this platform to tell the African story to the world the way it really is and project the Africa we want through the marketing of our Agenda 2063 and what it entails. Lastly, we want to position Africa for the possibility of hosting an edition of the World Expo in the nearest future. Simply put, through the participation of AU in this Expo, we aim to position the continent as a place for secure investment with a view to fulfilling the mandate of our agenda. Excellencies and gentlemen, I'm able to journey with us as we tell our story to the world, and also hope and strongly believe that you will partner with us, through a sustainable investment, even after the Expo is long gone. And thank you for being with us, and we look forward to further and more interaction in this press conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Levi. That was Dr. Levi Madweke, who is the AU Commissioner General at the Dubai World Expo 2020. Thank you very much for those remarks. And I'm very happy that you spoke about repositioning and reconfiguring the narrative around Africa so that people really have the correct idea of what Africa is all about, and Agenda 2063, of course. So thank you very, very much for those remarks. We now move on with our program, and coming up next, we have Mr. Ibrahima Sheikh Diong, and he is the United Nations Assistant Secretary General and also Director General of the Africa Risk Capacity Group, and that is that has the acronym ARC. So, Mr. Ibrahima, it's your turn. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Moderator. And I'd like to start by welcoming the opportunity to share the platform with my good sister, Mami, but also with Dr. Levi to convey the African message, but also the African a commitment to addressing disasters management on the continent. I welcome the opportunity of having this event and the one we're going to have tomorrow under the auspices of the African Union, underscoring the message that Mami mentioned earlier, and that is that the African Union leadership in addressing the effect of climate change and disaster across the continent. I think one opportunity provided by the Dubai Expo is to underscore the importance of global partnership. And therefore, it is important to seize this platform to reach out to the rest of the world, to demonstrate the African commitment, but also to showcase the importance of managing disaster before it occurs. It turns out that disaster does not discriminate. And if you wait till it happens, it may be too late in not saving lives and livelihood. So anticipation is extremely important. It is also important to highlight disaster does not mean the same thing to all of our countries in Africa. In some countries, we're talking about drought, like in the Sahel. In other countries, we're dealing with tropical cyclone. In others, also flooding is prevalent. But one thing all these disasters have in common is the human impact, the human face it has on vulnerable communities when it comes to food security, or the lives that we lose because of the disaster. So therefore, the African Union leading and showing the commitment we need to actually protect our people and their lives and livelihood, it is a sign that Africa is taking the lead and the rest of the community will actually follow. It is also important to mention that the commitment and the leadership of the African Union, it's not just words. The organization I'm actually leading was created by the African Union, the Africa Risk Capacity, as a way of demonstrating the importance of having an organization entirely dedicated to managing the effect of disaster across the continent. So there is, in addition to the commitment, but also institutions being set up to make sure that we match our words, our leadership, with actions that will help Africa to proceed. It is important to understand that in the organizations I'm leading, there are three elements that are extremely critical in addressing disaster on the continent. Is the ability to help African countries to understand the risk exposure to disaster before it actually occurs. And today, thanks to technology, we're able to actually model the disasters, and that helps African governments to decide whether to return the risk or to transfer the risk so they can mobilize resources before the disaster occurs. This is extremely critical in the sense Africa has so many competing needs in other sectors. So the ability to transfer the risk to the insurance market allows them to have additional resources to support the communities that are affected by disaster while we're waiting for the international community to come to our rescue. Again, another example of Africa leading in dealing with the impact of disaster. Let me make a couple of points and just wrap up, Madam Moderator. Number one, to say, we are heading to COP26. There's a lot of discussion about adaptation and mitigation. It is absolutely critical for Africa to also bear in mind the importance of resilience. We need to really put resilience on the table so that we can combine resilience, mitigation, and adaptation, and make sure that as we invest in adaptation in Africa, we make sure we leave no one behind as regard to disaster. I also want to highlight that not one organization alone can do this. And that's why I am delighted to have my good friend Mami on this panel, because of the great work that she does, combined with what we do at ARC. I believe we can strengthen the African capacity in dealing with the effect of disaster going forward. I also want to highlight the importance of gender. As you know, Winnie, quite well, across Africa, the most vulnerable people affected by disaster happen to be women. And that is why gender should not be just a lip service in our intervention. It should be embedded in our intervention in terms of our design, our advocacy. And that is why at ARC, we have the ambition to scale up our work, to be the partner of choice for African countries, to understand, once again, disaster does not discriminate, And if you wait till it happens, it's too late. And that's why we need action and we need it now. So over to you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much. That was Mr. Ibrahim Sheikh Diong from the Africa Risk Capacity, as well as from the United Nations. Thank you so much for those comments. You underscored there the importance of global partnership in tackling this challenge that we are talking about today, which is a disaster risk reduction. You also spoke about the leading role that Africa is playing, as well as its commitment to mitigating that. And I like that you mentioned that the time is now. It cannot be tomorrow. And that we are fighting against a kind of triplets in the form of resilience. We need to build resilience, we need to mitigate, and we need to adapt. And we need to be on top of the situation. So thank you very, very much for sharing those very rich comments with us. I will now open up the floor to colleague journalists who are online. And colleagues, if I can just ask you, if you have your questions, please use the question and answer feature that is on this Zoom platform. Please utilize the question and answer section that is on this Zoom platform. So I guess while we are waiting for colleague journalists to come in, we can come back to our panelists to see if they have any extra comments that they would like to make. Perhaps with Dr. Levy, if I can start with you, just to put all this in the context of Agenda 2063, so that our journalist friends who are listening can really, understand it from that perspective, since Agenda 2063 is an African-generated program that aims to ensure that we develop, we prosper, we stay in peace and in unity with one another. Dr. Levy, please just give us the context of Agenda 2063.
Okay, thank you, Winnie. Winnie, as you know, the African Union started when it was launched in 2002. And in 2013, when we celebrated the 50 years anniversary of the Organization of African Unity, we thought that it would be good to project for the next 50 years. And that was the birth of Agenda 2063. What does it entail? Within the Agenda 2063, we want to achieve 7 aspirations. The first one is what we call prosperity. Here, we want to ensure inclusive and sustainable growth to bring better livelihood to our people. Then we have integration. Here, we want to work with our member states. We want to work with our regions to make sure that we build that structure that will make us strong and speak with one voice. We have a mathematical equation that says that 55 is equal to 1, and that is how we have been structured. The next one is governance. We want to make sure that we promote good governance and rule of law. And that is why we have created what we call the Africa Governance Architecture. This is followed by the one called peace. Here we also want to maintain better peace and security condition in Africa. We have also established what we call the African Union Peace and Security Architecture. We have also put in place an early warning system to make sure that we are guided accordingly in spotting any conflict that may arise anywhere. Winnie, also we have an issue on our culture. We want to maintain our culture, we want to own our heritage. And that is why in 2021, the theme for the African Union is Earth, Culture and Heritage, levers for building the Africa we want. Then that is followed by what we call the people-driven. We want to be that Africa that creates, generates, produces, turns its raw materials into processed goods. We want to be that continent, that is not turned into a trading ground. We want to be that continent that is actually pushing forward and creating everything on its own. Then the last one is influence. Here, we actually want to be that continent that is strong, futuristic, and has the ability to take its rightful place at the global arena. Then within this context, we have what we call the flagship projects. I will not go into the details of all the flagship projects, but this flagship projects covers areas such as infrastructure and industrialization. We want to promote good education, and we are promoting what we call the Pan-African University and e-education. We are promoting women empowerment. We are promoting youth involvement, both in leadership, business, innovation. We want to ensure that our governance system is progressing very well. We also want to promote issues related to building resilient health system. You may also recall that we have put in place strong Africa Centers for Disease Control, which we have in different African regions, and we have the headquarters in Addis Ababa. We're also promoting aspects of agriculture, where we are doing a lot of things in terms of promoting issues of food security. All this actually game we want to play in this expo to let the people know that we are ready, we are open for business, and we are going to take them across our pavilion to see exactly how we have featured all these activities. And we're going to involve all our stakeholders, our partners in our 6-month program that is going to feature spotlights in these flagship projects of the African Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Levi. Thank you very much for that summary of Agenda 2063. It looked like we were losing you for a bit there, but I'm glad that the network held on until the end. So now we have a question, and this question is coming from someone from Kali Times. But before I read out that question, let me also remind journalists that they can either come through on the question and answer section, as I've mentioned, but also come through live. And all you need to do is to raise your hand, and then we will indicate for you to ask your question. So back to our question from Aniana Sankar, who is with the Kali Times. So he or she says, can you please tell us how you are trying to strengthen the investment partnership between the United Arab Emirates and the African countries? What are the major concerns that UAE investors have raised about investing in Africa? I think I'll start with you, Dr. Levy. Levy, can you hear us? All right, let me put that to any of the two panelists who are joining us, Ms. Mami or Mr. Ibrahima.
Well, let me volunteer on that question, not just because of disaster management, but because of a previous life. I used to promote African investments on the continent. But I think it's important to understand that what the African governments are doing is different actions to make Africa more attractive. Number one, across the continent, we are improving what we call the business environment, both from a policy and a legal framework whereby it's actually predictable in doing business in Africa and reducing actually the cost of doing business to make sure from a change of government, things are predictable to the extent that actually investors can be comfortable in going to African countries. I think second, most African countries are also reducing what I call the cost of doing business. And that is, if you don't have a reliable energy sector, if you don't have a good infrastructure sector in the country, it is extremely difficult to either industrialize or manufacture in the continent. I think that is something also Africans are doing and making sure that you can actually do business in the continent. I think third, with regard to human capital, you cannot actually invest in any countries unless you have reliable and competent human resources. And today on the continent, there's a lot of local expertise that can be utilized in making sure as you go to Africa, you can continue to work with Africa themselves. I think last but not least, there's a dynamic local private sector on the continent. And these are partners that international investors should like work with to make sure there's a value addition to Africa. There's an empowerment of the local private sector. So in the long run, it's not just about investing, it's also about transferring know-how and expertise to Africans so that we can build sustainability on the continent. That's what I will say as part of my previous life, as opposed to my current life in disaster risk management. So Winnie.
Thank you so much, Ibrahima. Let me ask Ms. Mami if you have a comment on that before we go on to the next question.
Yes, I'd like to echo what Ibrahima mentioned about the infrastructure and the crucial services that they provide to reduce the loss to damage to critical infrastructure and also disruption of basic service is one of the global targets of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And it is, as Ibrahima mentioned, important, extremely important in order to really bring in foreign investment. And of course, the other point is a lot of foreign investment now, I'm sure, will come into Africa to build the infrastructure. And at that time, what I really would like to request for the African governments and their partners to do is to build the infrastructure in a resilient way. Do not think that the extra dollar to make the infrastructure resilient is a cost. It is an investment so that the infrastructure is sustainable. Thank you, Winnie.
All right, thank you. Perhaps a logical follow-up question to some of the points that you both raised earlier on, and Levi, if you can hear us, is practically what's being done right now to mitigate disaster risk across the continent. If we can start with you, Mami, from the UNDRR, what practically are you doing to try and mitigate the risks of disasters across the African continent?
Right. So practically, we have been doing several things. One is it's important to understand the nature of risk that is the country surrounded. So we work with many African countries in order to, one, look at the historical loss and damage of that country, to understand what kinds of hazards, what kind of disasters have been attacking your country. But we also work with 16 African countries to put together their probabilistic risk profile. Now, this is about the future risk, and we bring in the growth of the population, the growth of the economy, and also the climate measures. How bad will the climate emergency will become, and make a risk assessment so that the governments can base their policy on it. The other thing I would mention is that we have also worked with a lot of African governments to look at their budget, review their budget together to see how much of their budget is actually put into building resilience. This way, governments can understand what is happening in their budget. Is it resilient enough? The third and last point I would mention is that we have a program called Making Cities Resilient 2030. Now, this started this year, but before 10 years, we had the Making City Resilient campaigns, and many cities in Africa have joined this. The city of Kisumu, the city of Kampala. And what we do is we work with the mayors and the city councils so that there is local resilience. We know from COVID-19 that the local resilience in the cities and communities are so important because these are the first ones who need to respond, but they need to prevent better in order to respond good. Well, so we work with a lot of African cities to build their resilience. Over to you, Winnie.
Thank you very much. Let me throw the same question to you, Ibrahima. I know that the Africa Risk Capacity has done quite a lot and continues to do quite a lot. And you have actually paid out to some countries that have been suffering from drought, for example. But we have many other risks across the continent. We had things like Cyclone Idai. We had a lot of such issues. So how is the ARC helping African countries? If you can just flesh out the details for us.
Well, we need a couple of things. First of all, it's important to highlight the problems we're trying to address, and that is disasters always associated across Africa with food insecurity. In most cases, communities will likely have to sell their assets to survive and protect their families. So the whole resilience is to help African communities to deal with the impact of disaster when it comes to food security, the impact it has on the disaster. The way we're helping basically at 3 levels, very quickly, with number 1, and to join what my sister Mami said earlier, and that is the importance of having a visibility on your risk profile of a country allows government to make 2 decisions. One is to retain the risk in the national budget, and the other one is actually to transfer the risk to the insurance market so they can mobilize resources in case to strengthen the contingency plan to be able to respond. So action number 1 is the risk profiling. If today, the advancement of technology is such you can model any risk, and I think Mami and I have spoken about this when I was in Geneva. I'm sure we'll join forces to do that more. I think second step that we do is what we call to prepare for disaster. Within member states, in this case 35 for today for ARC, any lack of preparation or coordination within government can cost life. So therefore, the importance of capacitating government entities so they can actually join forces and respond appropriately, it's extremely important in our response. And then the third thing we do is what we call the response. And that is that if government decide to transfer the risk to the insurance market, they have access to speedy resources in a way that the first response to be provided to our member states, it's done before the international community come and bring in some resources to the humanitarian aid that we know quite often. So that's where the innovation comes in. So far, since inception, we've been able to actually provide up to $720 million worth of coverage, all of our member states combined. So what it means in human terms and dollars, first of all, it's about $65 million. Actually, 65 million people being actually protected because of that coverage that I talked about. And out of actually those 65 million people, $65 million have been provided in terms of payout. What's important in the payout is the stories behind the payout. It's not just a big check handed over to the Minister of Finance, but we need to go beyond just the Minister of Finance and tell the stories about how this payout is actually impacting the life of Africans across the continent. I had witnessed this. I've gone to the field in Senegal, spoke to the communities, and see how this payout can actually save life and make Africa more resilient. And that's what we do concretely as an organization on behalf of the African Union in collaboration with the UN to show that the AU and the Africa Union can actually work together.
Thank you so much for that very detailed response. Livia, I don't know if you can still hear us or whether you are able to speak to us. I can see you are still online, but I know that you're having internet issues. All right, maybe not.
Just hold on 1 minute. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, it's terrible here.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, good.
No, I thought maybe you could just add on to the information that we've received, just to outline the setup at the African Union in terms of dealing with issues regarding disaster risk, the departments that are responsible and so on. All right, I think there are definitely internet issues there. So let me take a question that has come through on our WhatsApp platform, and I don't really have a name. The person did not put their name, but it is regarding the funding. Now, they say that you have mentioned that Africa is largely not responsible for the disaster crisis that we find ourselves in. So in terms of mitigating that, who is responsible, who bears responsibility for that, and especially in terms of funding and resources? I don't know who would like to take that, that question first.
I have a view, but let me hand over to Mami first. Maybe I'll come after you, Mami.
Okay, in terms of climate mitigation, it is quite obvious that the so-called G20 countries are the ones who really need to have ambitious, bold plans, nationally determined contributions in order to mitigate the emission of greenhouse gas. This is clear. And in terms of the funding, so under the Paris Agreement for climate action, the developed countries have committed to $100 billion a year contribution, international cooperation to what we call the Global South, so that all countries can mitigate and adapt to climate emergency. Unfortunately, so far, the commitment has not been met in full. So this is the first and foremost thing that needs to be done in order to bring the funding. But also when you look at the component of climate financing, now it is very important that climate adaptation, funding for climate adaptation is as much as climate mitigation, because while it is important to mitigate greenhouse gas emission, meanwhile, the impact of climate emergency, all the disasters are happening daily, and it's getting more and more increased. So the developing countries and the countries in African continent need the funding for adapting to climate action, climate emergency. And so this is why the Secretary General of the United Nations is saying, of the 100 billion, 50% needs to be mitigation, 50% needs to be adaptation. And this is still not yet the reality, but we are strongly advocating for this. Over to Ibrahima, my brother.
I think obviously Mami articulated quite well, and I just have to add the following, and that is that commitments were made in the billions, as Mami mentioned. Number one, we have to make sure those commitments are kept at the COP26. That's number one. Number two, I think the Africans, and I have no doubt under the African Union, will articulate in a way that the African voice is actually heard loud and clear at COP26 about the importance of thinking about how we can actually make sure Africa adapt and resilience, so the funding could also be channeled to Africa to mechanisms that need to be discussed. I think one plea I have to make from where I came from in terms of risk transfer, and I made this many times, and that is that even though what I just described can save lives, there's still some challenges with regard to the affordability, accessibility, and of premium financing, because African governments have other competing needs as well. So therefore, my plea is to have an African premium financing facility which will provide the necessary subsidies to our member states as we build the culture of risk transfer, with the hope that over time, those subsidies will disappear and countries will begin to then put risk transfer premium financing in their own national budget as well. So you can rest assured from an advocacy point of view, I look forward to making sure we can provide the support to Africa to support the risk transfer mechanism I have described earlier. Over to you, Winnie.
All right, thank you very much. I think this will be our last question, because I don't see any more questions coming through either online or from our WhatsApp group. But the last one will be from our WhatsApp group, and it's coming from someone called Tabitha Muchi. And Tabitha is asking about the responsibility of communities and individuals in disaster risk reduction. Again, either of you can start, and then the other one will follow through.
I'll go after you, Ibrahima.
Right, but I think the number one, as I said, in terms of the communities, I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, even though they don't contribute at all to the climate change debate, but at the end of the day, they get affected because of food security, because of outbreak and epidemic. And so I think number one, what we need to do, which we're doing in our case, is to listen to them and understand from an impact point of view, to what extent actually disaster is affecting them. That's the number one step. I think number two is also to make sure that in our case, when we actually transfer the risk and have a payout, we make sure that the distribution of those funds goes to the community that need them. So there is no way of deviating those funds whatsoever, and making sure at least it impacts the life of those communities as well. I think three, we also need to listen to their stories. Once those funds are actually given to them for resilient purposes, capturing their stories, listening to them, it's a way of at least demonstrating what we have described so far as a concept that actually works for them. And I think that's a way of just making sure we have the human aspect at the core of all of our intervention, because that is the only way we can measure success. And from our side, storytelling is embedded in everything that we do, because after all, if we can't demonstrate that what we do impact the lives of our people, in the end, it's just talk, but we have to talk the talk and walk the walk and make sure communities see the impact of what we do. So, Mami.
Thank you, Ibrahima. So let me add two things to what Ibrahima mentioned, because he brought out very important points. One is, in addition to listening, once we listen to the community, it's important that the local government brings the community into the process of making the actual plans and policies for disaster risk reduction, because who else than they know better how the resilience of their communities should be built based on the vulnerabilities they have. Vulnerabilities in terms of the group of people who are vulnerable that live in the community, also in the vulnerability in terms of the infrastructure, the houses that they live in, the ecosystem. Vulnerability is the biggest, risk element, I would say. Well, not the biggest, but it's an important element. And if we don't understand about the vulnerability of our community, then we cannot really tackle the risk drivers. So I think one responsibility, but I would say the role of the community, is to really identify the vulnerabilities and bring it into their discussion with the authorities about disaster risk management. Over to you, Winnie.
Thank you very much, Mami and Ibrahima. I'm glad to see that in disaster risk reduction, as in communication, it is not just the role of one particular entity or structure, that responsibilities cascade all the way down to the individual within the communities. We all have a role to play in mitigating that. So thank you so much. I don't see any more questions. I think that was the last one that we had. So I want to give this opportunity very briefly to my colleague Levi to just outline to us again the key highlights that people can look forward to at the African Union stand in Dubai. Perhaps outline what will be happening, when, and how people can get there. Very briefly, please, Levi.
Yeah, Winnie, sorry again for the breaks we'll be having today. Yeah, without wasting so much time in this regard, I think the highlight has been made. A lot of things will be happening. In the first place, we want to let the world actually know the ties we have with the United Arab Emirates and also with the League of Arab States as a region. We are working with this region, and in particular the UAE, to promote economic diversification and realization within Africa and promote trade. And that was why actually in January 2019, His Excellency, the chairperson of the African Union Commission, His Excellency Moussa Faki, signed an MOU with the United Arab Emirates, to drive economic diversification and industrialization, promote a resilient health system, and create many opportunities for project development. Throughout this time, we showcase what we are doing with them, we showcase what we are doing with partners, and we'll have the opportunity of getting our regional economic communities to show also how we are working together as one. We are going to work with all the member states that are here present, and they are going to get involved with all the spotlights on Africa. It is important to also inform that on 27 February, we are going to have the Honor Day, what we call the Africa Day. That will be another day, to bring everything into one umbrella, to bring all the arts, culture, festival of celebration of Africa to Dubai. And we are inviting everyone, to join us in this drive. We really want to let the world know that we are here. We welcome them to partner with us. We welcome them to come and invest in Africa. Africa is a secure destination for investment. And I believe at the end, the world will be happy that we came to Dubai to join them in showcasing the best of a continent. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you very much. And on that positive note from Africa, it's time for us to wrap up our press briefing for today. Just to give you some of the key highlights that have been mentioned by our speakers, let me start with Levi, who was the first one to give us his welcome remarks. And you heard him going out there to say that Africa is a safe and secure destination for investment, and that investors should feel free to come through, and that this Expo in Dubai is going to serve to showcase that potential for investment in Africa. So potential investors are welcome to the African Union stand. He also had that very strong slogan where he said, Africa is ready and open for business. So that is the message that came through from the African Union representative, Dr. Levi Madweke. Then we also heard from Mami, who is with UNDRR, and she spoke very strongly about the fact that there is actually a blueprint for building resilience across the world, and that countries are working together, and Africa is taking a very central and strong position in that drive to mitigate disaster risk. And she also mentioned something very interesting, that Africa is not really a big contributor to this crisis, but we are paying for it as a continent, and so we have to deal with it, and so we are engaged in that process. She also mentioned a very practical example of events that will be happening in Kenya. Those of you who would be able to go there, I think it would be great to witness the African commitment to disaster risk reduction. And then we also heard from Ibrahim Sheikh Diong from the Africa Risk Capacity, which is an agency that is affiliated to the African Union as well as to the United Nations. And he said that the Expo underscores the importance of global partnerships in DRR, and that the time is now to do something about it. And he also talked about the impact that it has on everybody across many socioeconomic aspects of our lives. He repeated again that Africa is taking a lead in this, spoke about COP26, and also spoke about those aspects of resilience, of mitigation and adaptation, as we hope to get the world to a better place in terms of disaster risks across the world. So thank you very much for joining us. That has been the very first press conference that we held here at the African Union, and from Dubai, where our colleagues are, and from different destinations where our panelists are. It was the first. I'm sure that there will be many more. And as Dr. Levy has said, there is much, much more that you can look forward to between now and the 6 months that the Expo will be held in. So let me take the chance to thank very much our panelists for today, starting with Dr. Levi Madweke, who is the AU Expo Commissioner General. Mami Mizutori, who is the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and head of the UNDRR, and Ibrahima Sheikh Diong, who is the UN Assistant Secretary General and Director General of the Africa Risk Capacity Group, in other words, known as ARC. So once again, my name is Wayne Musabayana. It has been a pleasure having you with us. Join us in future sessions of press briefings on the Dubai World Expo. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you.